So welcome all of you. My name is Fischer. I'm a faculty member here at the Global Development Institute. So this is a GDI lecture. So of course some of you may be from Manchester, but a lot of you are also, this is welcome to Manchester first of all. Many of you may not have been here before, but it's an odd thing that it's not raining now. You have to say one joke about the weather at least.
Thank you,
And it's a 3-day workshop, right? And just to give you a bit of background about this, last year, 2 years ago, Caroline Cornier and Guido Maschaft, I hope I pronounced that right, established a PhD Political Economy of Development group linked to the DSA and IADI. And the group is now 40 or 50 PhDs strong. Basically, I think the motivation, and hopefully you'll talk about it a bit also over the next few days, was that political economy is being decentered within development studies, whereas it was, of course, a core discipline within development studies for a long time. So it was to bring people together across different institutions to have a space to discuss political economy. And they succeeded quite a lot in doing this. They have monthly meetings of different kinds, and they also organized other kind of seminars and events as well online. And this, we wanted to find a way to get everyone together because obviously they were meeting constantly online. So luckily the IADI Innovation Fund published this opportunity of getting some money to hold an event. So Guido and Caroline led submitted an application on this call, which many of you may have seen online, called Re-establishing Political Economy and Development Studies. We got over 50, I think, submissions. And of course the core idea of it was that we're going to have a special issue around this. So we've asked a lot of the early careers who are here for the Friday event to submit papers, and these papers have been submitted, and we'll be reviewing and discussing this in line with submitting a special issue later, sometime next year, hopefully. So that was the core initiative of this. And then there was a second initiative. Andy Sumner and I lead a group called the Politics of and Political Economy of Economic Transformation at IADI. So we were planning to do an event anyway. And we were going to do an event around, initially it was about Celso Furtado's work, 50th anniversary of his paper, the book. Yeah. So, but we were worried we wouldn't get enough submissions at a late date. So one of the reasons we wanted to hold this event was to kind of have a space around this which is linked to the PhDs. So related to this, we also wanted to do more work on this kind of dialectic between dependency and development, which many of us work within around the developmental state and dependency, the constraints of contemporary globalization. So in relation to this and Furtado's work, we couldn't think of a better keynote as Andrew Fischer, who worked on Furtado for a long time and linked ideas. So he'll be giving the GDI lecture, which is also a lecture of this event. If I have anything else to say. Oh, I'll go into the introduction now. So I first came across Andrew's work when I was a PhD student teaching in SOAS and Development Studies, a course called Political Economy of Development. And we used to read one of his papers called Putting Aid in Its Place. Then I moved to the LC, where I was an LC fellow on top with Kate. And again, we were reading this paper called Putting Aid in Its Place, which he also taught that course many years ago, DV400, which if you did the master's in LC, you may also take that. And over the years, of course, I've read a lot of his work, as many of you may have, about this exact topic, about the challenge of late development under contemporary globalization and around dependency issues. So today, Andrew will talk about the myth of deindustrialization and the possibilities of development within industrial civilization. Andrew Fischer is a professor of inequality, social protection and development at ISS in The Hague, and chair of development and change. He has worked extensively on various fields across development studies, poverty, inequality, social policy, deindustrialization as well, and debt. And in various regions across the world, particularly in China, Tibet as well, but also across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He is the author of the award-winning book, Poverty and Ideology, which received the International Studies in Poverty Prize. We've asked Andrew to speak for about 40 minutes. Last time I asked Andrew to speak, I got into a lot of trouble because I let him speak for too long. So I will be a serious timekeeper this time. Okay. Well, welcome all of you to Manchester, and thank you, Andrew.
Thanks. So I printed out some notes, but it's so small I'll have to go between glasses and no glasses. But thank you so much for inviting me here. I mean, among colleagues, I guess a number of us probably could have given the talk, but so it's a nice room where we're among equals and sharing the thoughts and so on. So I'll try and do my best to say something that will hopefully inspire some thought and discussion. Obviously, I think the initial title was Possibilities of Development, right? And I thought, well, in terms of possibility, is development possible? It's still possible was the title. Oh yeah, is development still possible? Thank you. And of course, my immediate response was yes, of course, because from this article I just contributed, I gave it. My answer was always initially from a demographic perspective, where we can see development in a very positive light, which is the reduction of infant and child mortality and increasing the chances for children to survive to the age of 5, which is possible and positive and ongoing. And we could see this in terms of global development, for instance, which one of the reviewers of the article suggested, in the sense that it's a global phenomenon that's happening across the world, has causes that are in a sense global and not national. Although, again, based on its attributes of sort of lateness and lagging, or the historical sort of how it pans out historically, it does have extremely different implications for the global north and the global south. That's what I was arguing in this article. But that being said, that was my initial response. And that being said, this talk will be more about the economic development, which is, or entirely about economic development, which is of course much more, how should we say, dismal, less optimistic in a sense. And where answering that question, is development still possible, is a challenging question in a sense, right? Of course, when I asked Andy and British what they meant by this title, they told me, well, it was The Myth of Economic Development by Celso Furtado, which was published in 1974, but was translated in 2020. So I think if you weren't Portuguese, you probably didn't know about that particular book until recently. With a wonderful introduction also by Ndongo Sambasila, who's a great Senegalese heterodox economist. And I would say in that book, it's very similar to, the basic arguments in that book are very similar to many of the other things he has written around that time period. I mean, a book that was very influential for me was the book called Accumulation and Development. What was the title again? The Accumulation and Development, the Rise of Industrial Civilization, or the something other industrial civilization, which is where the term industrialized civilization comes from in that sense. And he also, another paper, a very excellent paper that was translated in 1973 by a Caribbean journal at the time, Social and Economic Studies, I think it was called. It's called The Brazilian Model. So I think a lot of his ideas, especially as he emerges more into the 70s, are expressed in these various works, which have all been translated now, which is wonderful. So so that's where my ideas in this lecture will draw from. Also just to say that in The Myth of Economic Development, as I said, it's very similar. He's making quite basically the same arguments he makes in Accumulation and Development, except he's framing it in terms of the limits of growth, or the limits to growth. That was published in 1972 by Meadows and other authors. It was the big article that it kind of is the prequel to degrowth, in a sense. And his critique of that book was essentially that their projections for how the world would evolve into the future were based on the assumption that the developing countries then would become like the rich countries were then, right? And that so if Africa and Latin America consume like Americans, the world's gone. You know, it's done for, basically, right? And he was basically saying the problem with that argument is that that's unlikely to happen, right? Basically, that the rich countries wouldn't let that happen, and it's unlikely also based on the nature of development as it was occurring in Latin America and elsewhere, that could happen anyways, right? And that's where he then goes back into his whole thesis of industrial civilization, in a sense. So that's the context in which he's writing and he's making his arguments. So in this lecture, I want to make basically 4 main points, roughly speaking. Oh, I was going to say too that this is when I realized it was about Furtado as well. Andy's been trying to get me to write something on Furtado now for, I think, close to 10 years. So maybe this was an incentive to get me to continue writing on it and writing it down. But the 4 main points, which could be the structure of a book actually, is first industrial civilization, talking about the idea, what he means by industrial civilization. Second is deindustrialization, or what I call the myth of deindustrialization, to be a bit provocative. The third is what I call Furtadian flips, which I'll explain. And the last point is perhaps my answer to the question, is development still possible? Perhaps, but it would require massive scaling up of redistribution to a level that we still haven't, at a global level, and that's perhaps the only way we can survive, in a sense. That would be my answer in a nutshell, which I'll get to through this logic of this presentation. So on the first point, industrial civilization, what Furtado refers to when he's talking about industrial civilization is essentially, I paraphrased it here, I didn't cite him, I paraphrased him in this article I wrote 2019. It was in that journal article debating Horner and Hulme on global development. And it's basically this idea that both production and consumption increasingly pass through industrial processes. So our entire sort of experience of life, in a sense, whether it be what we consume, not necessarily what we produce, because most of us are not producing industrial goods, we're not involved in industries, but definitely through our consumption, we're integrated into this increasing industrialization of everything, right? And I'll come back to that point about consumption, because it's a very important point that Furtado was raising. It's too bad actually Hazel's not here, because she likes talking about consumption. Hazel's not here, is she? No. Okay, we'll hear about Hazel talking about consumption. So I express this idea this way: the structuring of an entire economy, including the consumption patterns of its poor and more marginalized members around industrial processes and technologies, even if large parts of the economy are not involved in industrial production per se, or even becoming progressively marginalized from it, right? From the wealth generated by the industrial processes. And in this sense also, I think industrialization, if anyone's figured out who Pseudo Erasmus is, let me know. But I mean, I agree with him on a point, and he tweeted about it at one point, which is that industrialization isn't only or just about manufacturing, whereas the emphasis is always manufacturing. Because manufacturing itself could also be artisanal, right? A lot of manufacturing is actually the labor-intensive or even cottage-type industry. Manufacturing is quite artisanal. With technology, we are really talking about, in its most sort of essentialized sense, the application of technology and machines to the production process, right? Or to the production process, or also to the tangible things, in a sense, right? So it could include, and it could go into some of the services where services are actually tangible. It's something that you can actually measure consistently, like transport, for instance. So the photo that you saw in the beginning was about these big, massive, the ships transporting all our goods for trade. There's definitely been industrialization of shipping in that sense. You also have the industrialization of agriculture, so it's not, again, just manufacturing. And Kramer and DeJohn and others wrote an article about the sort of industrialization of freshness, for instance, in agriculture. And it's very much, when we talk about structuralists, like in development economics, it's very much at the core of structural transformation. So when we're talking about structural transformation, we're really talking about industrialization. And because it's really about the increasing productivity of labor. right, through the application of technology machines, which then sets off a whole bunch of processes that leads to growth and leads to structural transformation. So structural transformation and growth are the outcomes of this process of increasing productivity of labor across various sectors, right? Although that being said, I was just mentioning consumption, so anyways, so yeah. That being said, the service sector is the one sector where measuring labor productivity is very tricky, right? Which I'll come back to, or it's possibly not even possible in the sense that, you know, if you talk about the productivity of teaching, as you increase the classroom size and you're teaching more students, actually the good is not even comparable because it becomes a different product in a sense, or it becomes a different service. So you can't even compare, you know, the service to measure whether the productivity of the service is increasing and so on. So services, once we go into these more intangible types of things like services and so on, the whole logic of productivity breaks down in a sense, right? Which I've also written about in something. So drawing from this understanding, I've myself, again in that 2019 article, but it's also in this book I wrote in 2014, tried to sort of say, okay, well, so what is economic development, or what we call capitalist economic development? We could understand it as an increasing amount of value added produced per person. I mean, it's in its most essential sense, right? Achieved through increasing labor productivity, meaning output per unit of labor time rather than simply people working more or more people working, right? Which is just the sort of solo growth adding people to production. And sustained by capital accumulation at a relatively broad economic scale. At the aggregate level, increasing labor productivity usually results in synergies of increasing degrees of specialization and scales of production, as well as increasing applications of technology in the production processes. And I would include their social organization as a form of technology. We can talk about sort of social technologies in a sense. There's a brilliant Canadian, I'm not sure, she was actually a metallurgist, but also a major Canadian thinker, Ursula Franklin, who talks about sort of technology as a social process rather than, I think a lot of people actually talk about that. But and it raises the question here as well of boundaries. Like when we talk about something sort of economically developing or industrializing, where do you draw actually the boundaries? You know, at the local level, at the firm level, at the regional level, at the country level, even though most of the country might not actually be involved in industrialization, we talk about a country industrializing, right? So, or do we even draw the boundary at the global level, right? Which was the argument of dependency theorists in a sense, right? They were basically saying, you know, we have to understand the whole world in a sense, especially in the 20th century, is integrated into this process and hence part of is sort of an integral part of the process of industrialization rather than seeing them as separate and needing to industrialize, right? Sort of like the way you would think of the working classes as being part of the industrialization process rather than being sort of pre-capitalists needing to become capitalists, the way maybe human capital theory would see it in a sense. And I mean, that was an issue that I was discussing in the context of my research in China because, you know, you talk about large swathes of, say, China where there's no industrial activity happening per se, but because they're integrated into a national space where there's processes of circulation throughout the national space, all of the regions then get affected by and shaped by and structured by the intensive increases in productivity happening in certain specific locations, right? I'm sure geographers talk about this stuff, but I'm not a geographer. So anyways, and in this sense also, I think states are crucial as some of the leading agents driving the industrialization process, as well as obviously the capitalists. Especially, I would say, in rich countries or the central countries, in the sense that, you know, even in the high time of neoliberalism, you had the U.S. had a very active industrial policy. It was called Pentagon, right? The Pentagon, in a sense. So Pentagon spending was used very effectively in the 80s and 90s to shape various strategic industries in the U.S. People like Fred Bloch have written about that, for instance, and Mariana Mazzucato also picks that up. And so on, but builds off that existing literature. But also, I think the state-nation in that sense is also very important because when you think of it in a sense, it's the scale, the largest scale at which a significant amount of redistribution and circulation happens from, say, the productive sectors to the rest of the economy. Whereas, once you leave sort of outside the state, there's very little redistributive processes that actually happen in a sense. There's some via trade and other things, but not necessarily in more of sort of the space of circulation or the space of redistribution. It's really a state that tends to, or the nation that tends to contain those things. I mean, we could discuss that perhaps, so for instance, you will have wage norms in the economy being established by the degrees of productivity in say, industries and agriculture and so on, which then those wage norms become sort of dispersed throughout the entire economy. This is what we see in China, for instance, right? So the wage norms in Western China would be influenced by wage norms and productivity levels in Eastern China. But then beyond the border, you don't really see that being then transmitted to the neighboring country in a sense, right? So I've been, and this also comes back to my point at the end in terms of the importance of global redistribution or international redistribution, because we haven't really, the aid system, for instance, hasn't really produced much redistribution. That would be one of my big critiques about the aid system. And I think this also is an interesting point in terms of how it relates to the international development versus global development debate, and perhaps in the wrong place to be raising this issue. But no, just because, British is here, so he'll protect me. But I think it was it's just, a lot of it becomes a bit semantic, whether we're actually talking about semantic differences and so on. I think one of the pushbacks against in the debate was this idea that sort of international development was a bit being characterized, that it's about aid, or it's about the aid industry, or it's about like DFID, international development, and so on. It was interesting talking to my old professor and mentor in development economics, Carrie Polanyi-Levitt, and when I discussed it with her, for her understanding of international was very important. It was the international, it was the internation. It was the fact that the nation is important, the state is important, and when you adopt the language of, say, global development, the state disappears, the nation disappears, as this extremely important vehicle that has been driving the development process, at least in the last 200 years, right? And that's still very important today. I think it's very, if we might have thought, if we could have sort of allowed ourselves to believe it was becoming less important, I think Trump has made us realize how powerful the state can be, even when a crazy man is in charge of it, right? Anyways, that was a little tangent I just wanted to say. So it's a different understanding about international in that sense as well. So, okay, to get back to the idea of consumption again, industrialization, civilization. So it's about, for Furtado, it was very much about the central importance, this is what I mentioned to you, of consumption, not just production, right? In the sense that, if I can follow my own thinking and notes, that, oh, there I am, yes, okay. Yeah, anyways, I think I made that point. I'll just go on because I actually didn't start my timer, so I don't know how much time is left. 20 minutes. Okay, yeah, I better speed up then. But I mean, it's the fact that we are integrated into what he called industrial civilization through consumption more. It's more powerful than through production, right? I was even going to say that to a certain extent, as industrialization advances, the majority of the population becomes severed from even experience of industrial production, to the extent that it almost becomes like a sort of neo-magical type of phenomenon. Like, I have no idea how ones and zeros produce virtual reality or artificial intelligence or things like that. So it can almost become like these things are magical, right? Because we are so separated, in a sense, from the process of production. But also, I think this idea of consumption, I'll come back to it, but the idea of consumption is very important in developing countries because, I mean, when you think of, I just threw up, not to pick on Kenya, but it was just because I've been talking to somebody about Kenya, Radha, for instance, about digital technologies and banking, digital banking and so on. And she was saying that 95% of urban Kenyas and 90% of Kenyans overall have been integrated into digital banking, right, via Safaricom and so on and things like that. I think the poverty rate is what? What's the poverty rate? 25 at least, 35%, something like that. But what you're talking about is that, so the vast majority of the population is integrated into very industrialized forms of consumption, which account for a larger and larger proportion of their incomes and of the sort of their essential basic needs, even though they're not involved at all with the production of these things and so on, right? So that's, and yet it's straight right down to the level of their spending, their incomes, their revenue, their expenditures, and so on. It shapes their reality in that sense. So in that sense, we're in an increasingly industrial world at a global scale through production and consumption, and it hasn't ceased. And it fundamentally shapes our lives, artificial intelligence being a good example. And it's not a normative statement here, it's just a statement that this has both negative and positive aspects. It's just, you know, I don't think I need to go into that with this group here. So, okay, the second point then, I hope I didn't spend too much time on that, is, okay, I'm being a bit provocative by saying deindustrialization is a myth or a misnomer. But basically what I'm referring to here is that what we call, the image that we have of deindustrialization is something like this, right? So wastelands where factories have closed down, populations have left, things fall apart, and so on, which exist. It is a real thing. But in certain locations, regions, as there's restructuring movements of industries and so on, there's of course some pushback against the idea. I only found that in Forbes while I was preparing for this lecture, so I don't, you know, but just to say that there's some people also pushing back against this idea. But the argument I'm making is that that what we call deindustrialization is basically referring to not specifically those things, or it can refer to those things, but it's referring to two fundamental measures, which is the manufacturing value added, the share of manufacturing value added of total GDP, and the share of manufacturing employment out of total employment, right? That's how Danny Roderick measures it, Acemoglu, Timmer, and others, you know, basically all the economists would measure it that way, right? We accept that. And the issue is that those measures are not necessarily, although sometimes they might, measure those pictures we saw on the previous slide, but what they're largely capturing is the continuing advancement of industrialization as a process, right? Which some economists actually do, you know, recognize. And, I mean, Timmer, for instance, well, not contesting these measurements, would also talk about that to a certain degree he would recognize that these are reflecting the continuing advancement of industrialization. And in that sense, it's a misnomer in a sense. So when you think of what industrialization is, it's the increasing productivity of labor, which basically it results in, do I have it written here? Just a second, just for my notes. So, what I was going to say here as well is that if you use these measures, for instance, even China will appear as deindustrializing, right? So in terms of secondary shares, particularly in industry, you can see that dotted blue line. It was actually higher in 1978 than it's been ever since. And then it had a second peak sometime in the mid-2000s, but in the course of the last 2 decades has been effectively deindustrializing by that measure, right? Also, in terms of employment, it's also been deindustrializing since the maybe 2010, in a sense, if you would use this as a measure. But if you think of what's actually going on, say in the case of China, with this very rapid increase in productivity of labor, you know, through robotics and other things, is that you obviously it becomes, you use less labor, so the labor share falls as part of that process of increasing productivity. But also the unit values of the output fall. So the unit values fall partly because the labor costs per unit fall, and also partly because of the economies of scale, and also because of the marginal costs. Once you have, say, a machine, the marginal cost of producing each extra thing become very, very minimal in a sense. And so you find that the values in the actual physical product get squeezed through that process. And insofar as the overall value produced from that process raises, you know, levels of incomes generally, then that also, the terms of trade essentially turn against manufacturing goods vis-a-vis the services. Right? A good example of that is one factory I visited in the US, for instance. It was actually an advanced circuit technology, so basically making producing circuit boards. And they were actually giving a good example. Like in the 1980s, they were literally like in lab coats placing pieces on the circuit board, welding it with little miniature devices and so on. But still at that type of level of production. Whereas, say, when I visited in the early 2010s, they had just purchased this one machine that was, about yay big, and it was basically the components in it were moving so fast you couldn't even see them. Right? It was like it was that fast. It was like the hummingbird's wings or something like that, and it was producing so much that if they would use it at full capacity, what they were currently selling was only about 10% of what they could actually produce at full capacity if they would use that machine at full capacity, right? So, and it's through that process from, say, the 1980s to the 2010s, there's an extraordinary increase in the productivity of physical output, right? Which is at the core of the climate crisis, is at the core of all these different things we talk about. But the reality is that in these measures, it shows up as deindustrialization, right? And what's also interesting, of course, is that within the firm itself, what happens, okay, in the case of this factory, they didn't fire any of the workers. They kept the same workforce, just trained them with new machines and so on. But because you then have this huge amount of output, that's basically, to a certain degree, you're just trying to keep up with. You're struggling with issues of overcapacity, right? Which we always talk about the Chinese, but it's happening in every factory around the world that's adopting technology like this. And then you're also, to deal with that, you have to hire more labor in terms of sales and marketing, basically, right? So what happens is within the company itself, the sales and marketing department starts to grow because you're actually dealing with how do we deal with this massive increase in what we can actually produce to actually make this machine, to basically profit from this machine, right? And obviously, the impulse, because the machine's so expensive, the impulse is then to produce as much as you can. So all the things we blame about China could be applied to any factory around the world, in a sense, right? But that story shows how just the application of technology within a firm, within the firm itself, produces a shift towards the tertiary sector, towards service employment, and how the value then gets concentrated in, say, sales and marketing, and the unit value of what's being produced is in the sense shrinking, even though they're producing a huge amount of those units right now in a much faster process than they would have done just 20, 30 years ago. And that would show up, according to these conventional measures, as deindustrialization. And that's, I think, part of the problem is that's what produces this discourse about stagnant productivity in, say, Europe or the US, for instance. You've probably heard that before in terms of how a problem with Europe is it's not productive enough, even while Europe is going through this process of revolutionary increases in physical, tangible productivity. And the problem is that the way they actually measure productivity, by necessity, economists, is through value added, not through the actual physical output, because you're dealing with different goods, right? So you can't talk about economy-wide productivity because your productivity in computer chips is different from your productivity in ships, is different from your productivity in cars, and so on. You can't compare cars with computer chips. Hence, you convert it all into monetary value added. And so what you're actually measuring is more the revenue, because it's the output times the value, rather than actually the physical productivity. So while the physical productivity is sort of revolutionizing, you can have stagnant value because of the declining prices per unit of that output and these types of things, right? So that's part of the problem with a lot of these measures. And I would say also that mainstream economics more generally, I don't know if I have time to go into this tangent. I have 10 minutes? Okay, mainstream economics more generally still struggles with productivity because it's still dealing with the legacy of basically total factor productivity measures which derive from the solo growth model, which itself is a model, a neoclassical growth model based on one good, say corn, which can both be a consumer good or a capital good, corn for eating or corn for planting. And basically, through that, they're trying to mimic a process of growth. but as a result, the total factor productivity doesn't really have a proper understanding of what capital is in terms of sort of the application of capital to enhance the productivity of labor. It's treated more as a substitute to labor. And as a result, they don't even refer to the word productivity. They refer to productivity as efficiency, sort of the solar residual in a sense, which isn't the same thing, because efficiency is very different from productivity, right? I mean, we know that from, if you're into agrarian studies, the land size productivity debates, labor productivity, by increasing the amount you produce with your labor time, can actually have the inverse effect of being less efficient with the use of resources, because you're trying to do things more quickly. If you're very efficient with the use of resources, you might actually have a low labor productivity, right? Like, I mean, I always like the example when I'd arrived a couple of times in Tibet, and they would have just, say, killed a goat. Sounds horrible, but anyways. And, you know, they would spend the whole day taking every single organ out of that goat, right, and making things out of the whole goat. An amazing efficiency use of resources, but it was only one goat for the whole day, right? So whereas opposed to modern manufacturing, where they're maybe doing thousands of goats in a day through machines and so on for the same amount of labor, right? And so, so you can often have the opposite of where efficiency works against productivity in that sense. And you also see that in the industrial scale. So for instance, the creation of firms. I was also going to go into another tangent about Coase theories of the firm, about, you know, Coase asked, why do firms exist if perfectly competitive markets have the perfect optimal outcome, right? Which, again, my old professor, Kerry Polanyi-Levitt, said was a stupid, you know, what he said basically was, the reason is to reduce transaction costs. So Kerry would say, well, that's a stupid answer for a stupid question, but he won a Nobel Prize for it anyways. But the point is that, you know, what fundamentally drives firms to incorporate, partly it's because of economies of scale, especially in the industrialization process, but also it's to amass profits, right? Because if you only use, you can do something really, really well and have a very high profit rate for your time, but because you're only one person, you can only earn so much, right? Whereas if you hire 100 people to do the work, they might have a lower profit rate. You have to spend a lot of money on disciplining them and so on. It becomes very inefficient, but because you can extract a surplus from each of their labor, you make more total profits, right? Which is fundamentally, it's probably a Marxist explanation for why firms exist and so on. But it's just to say that there's, I think, a lot of confusion in economics because of the legacy of this neoclassical thinking to describe these processes of increasing productivity, that they have sort of tools that are mislabeling it. I was just going to show this machine because this is the ASML's machine. They have like a monopoly in the whole world. And this is what we're talking about when Europe has a labor productivity problem and it's producing this. It's like the most complex machine in the world, apparently. It has like millions of parts. It costs $350 million. And it's basically, they have the monopoly because everyone needs this to produce these 2 nanometer chips, for instance, right now. And also, if you look at Dutch agriculture and so on, it's like anyways, I'll go on. I think I made my point. I have to run ahead because I don't want to, I have 2 more sections to talk about. But I'll write this up. Furtadian flips. The basic idea of Furtadian flips is that, getting back to the idea of consumption, is that in the historical progression of industrialization, industrial leaders, the first industrializers, production precedes consumption, right? So you don't buy and drive a car until somebody invents a car and produces it, right? Whereas for latecomers, especially in the post-war period for developing countries, pretty much all developing countries, consumption precedes production, in the sense that cars already exist and you import them and consume them, right? And then you try to figure out how to build them yourself, right? So pretty much, especially entering into the post-war period, say 1950s, pretty much everything you could want to consume that was an industrial good could be supplied to you through imports, right? So, and this is what Furtado was saying, is he said actually, you know, Latin America, for instance, because he was talking about mostly Latin America, emerged into a situation where they were consuming the industrial goods from Europe, and they were increasing their income to be able to do so, but they weren't increasing their income through economic development, through productivity increases and so on. They were doing it by just exploiting more resources, or perhaps through reshifting specialization into products where commodity prices were rising and so on, but it wasn't through a process of increasing productivity of labor. And this flip, in a sense, where you access 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll speed up now. This flip is fundamental because it basically fundamentally sets off a completely different dynamic in terms of how industrialization affects the structure of your economy. And this is the essence of structuralism. Structuralism is not just about moving from agriculture to industry to services. It's about this, the Latin American structuralism. It's about how this process and the way you enter into the process fundamentally structures your economy and your articulations of your economy in fundamentally different ways than the way they happen in the early industrializers in the center. So I give some examples there. It establishes dependency. Import substitution is intrinsic to industrialization. You cannot industrialize without doing import substitution. It's not a choice, it's just a reality. It also leads to polarization, marginalization, which I don't have time to go into because I just have 4 minutes. And I mean, this is a good example of how Furtado analyzes this in his famous Brazilian model article. Just to go through this quickly, he says what happens is you have a demand profile which corresponds to a demand profile that corresponds to a concentration of income distribution, so inequality, and also entails composition of investment that maximizes the transfer of technological processes through multinational corporations and increases the flow of foreign resources. That will bring about sort of the fastest growth rates, say in the Brazilian economy. So he wasn't saying that Brazil wasn't industrializing, it wasn't developing, but it was developing in this very perverse way that was bringing about all these other things that I read about here, including the structural tendency to exclude the mass of the population, hence problems with informality, and also it relies on the capacity of ruling groups to suppress all forms of opposition. I don't have time to say more about that, so I'm getting to my last point in the last 2 minutes on the redistributive imperative. Basically what I've been arguing, I wrote about this, and I need to write more about it, is basically that what I'm referring to is basically what I would refer to as the structural necessity of redistribution as a core function of complex modern economies and societies. That as we go through this process of industrialization and you have this increasing complexity and increasing concentration of the creation of value, that it relies then on, the whole system relies on increasing the circulation of that value through the economy, without which the economies become essentially sort of dysfunctional, as Celso Furtado would say, organized forms of development have difficulty taking root, right? And I think part of what we can see with the dysfunctionalities of the neoliberal period is this undermining of this redistributive principle that has then caused a lot of sort of dysfunctionality in the countries that have been affected by it most and so on. I don't really have too much time to go into this external constraints. But what I'm saying, Furtado in a nutshell, it's forcing me to put everything into a nutshell. Furtado would say not only is this happening at sort of a national domestic scale, but it's very important to understand, especially in the 20th century, that this process of industrialization is no longer, or we could call it capitalism if you wish, but industrialization is really talking about what's driving the productivity changes. It's no longer happening at the scale of national economies, but is very much a global process driven by sort of international corporations, global corporations, that are the primary vehicles organizing the industrialization process, the production process. And then, okay, because of that, the effect of that on the peripheries then becomes the dependence on imports and so on, sets off a process of basically external foreign exchange constraints. So basically, if you go to any of these countries, they're constantly dealing with a constant situation of extreme austerity imposed on the economy by lack of foreign exchange, right? And which is exacerbated through liberalization and so on. And I think an important point also for the structuralists, Latin American structuralists and dependency theorists, is they weren't just simply saying this is because of the colonial setup of specialization of primary commodities and so on, but even as you try to industrialize out of this, it reinforces it and intensifies it, because the process of industrialization itself tends to exacerbate the foreign exchange constraint because it's very import dependent. right? And the perfect example of this is South Korea. South Korea, as it was industrializing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was running these very, very deep trade deficits, which were basically financed by initially aid and subsequently by a lot of official loans, basically. So, you know, well-priced loans from Japan and the U.S. multilateral agencies. So I've written about this. I don't have time to go into it. But you contrast that with, this brings out the importance of not just the national processes of redistribution, but the international processes of redistribution to deal with a global economy that's industrializing. And hence, not only, you know, the increasing concentration of these flows of value, and the necessity to have globalized processes of redistributing and circulating that value through the economy rather than just national processes. The opposite of that, the dystopic version of that, is what we see in, say, countries like Zambia. And this is what I've been working on recently, is basically, this is a typical situation where you have a country that has an export surplus. Most of it, the export surplus, is being drained through the services, which are controlled by multinational corporations and so on, as well as profit remittances, which is the solid red line. But also, you had this other one, I just discovered it, and I've been looking into it more and more, this obscured forms of basically financial outflows hidden on different parts of the financial account, which in the case of Zambia, in the midst of, say, default, reached about 20% of GDP. So in total, you have, for instance, in 2021, when the country was in default, you had combined profit remittances and these other wealth flows amounting to about 27, almost 28% of GDP in 1 year, which is absolutely enormous. And this is kind of like a mirror reflection of its trade surpluses, which are dominated by multinational corporations, right? Basically the mining companies. And just to say, one thing I've been working on, or I want to work on more, is to extend this analysis across a whole bunch of different African countries, which I'm hoping to do with Ndongo. And I just quickly looked at Guinea, for instance, and you see the exact same thing, actually. It's quite striking. So Guinea, of course, has one of the largest, or the largest, iron ore mines in the world, crucial for the green, agenda. Iron ore is really important for all this green stuff. Anyways, Ilias can tell us about it. But it's just to say, if you look at this is the perversity of the situation, where it's running a goods balance of 6.5 million, but that would be controlled by a foreign mining corporation, dominated by the whoever owns that iron ore mine. In the meantime, you have a services balance and the primary balance that almost knocks out 3/4 of it, leaving you with a slight current account balance in the positive. Then you have some inflows of secondary income and FDI, but then you have on this obscure part of the financial account that I've been tracking this massive outflow of almost $4 billion that more than knocks out the rest of the current account balance, right? And then just to say that aid relative to this whole process is it's a decent amount of money. I wouldn't complain about $500 million, but it's nonetheless, it's being thrown into a situation where you have these already massive outflows of wealth, and so it's just contributing essentially to the pool of foreign exchange that's already basically streaming out of the country in a sense, right? And is not being absorbed. The important point here is that the aid is not being absorbed, right? It's okay. It's over. So the key point is that in terms of the redistributive imperative, to start with is how to end this situation and reverse it, right? In addition to all the other things we could think of, which I don't have time to go into because I've used up my time and I can see British wants me to stop. So, but basically, yeah, but this is, I think we have to understand it's a reflection of this industrialization process being led, it's the industrialization of mining, led and dominated by foreign firms, and where these economies are just, what this reflects is just the economy being used almost like as a receptacle for the trade and the financial activities of the firm. What we're just basically seeing here is a reflection more of the mining company using their flows of value rather than actually contributing to any form of national development in this context. So that's what we really need to confront in a sense. Thanks.